In the quiet Midwest town of Ridgway, beneath the charm of its tree-lined streets and friendly faces, a storm is brewing. Leah Peterson, a determined young police officer, finds herself standing at the crossroads of justice and corruption. Ridgway is a town divided its people, torn between hope for change and fear of losing what little they have left. When a series of protests led by a disillusioned man, Rick Harrison, spirals out of control, Leah uncovers a sinister web of manipulation and greed orchestrated by Gerald Warren, Ridgway's most powerful figure. As tensions escalate and long-buried secrets surface, Leah is forced to confront not only the town's hidden darkness, but her own past and the legacy of her late father, a police officer who died under suspicious circumstances. With allies both unexpected and steadfast, Leah embarks on a journey to expose the truth and bring the town back from the brink. But with threats mounting and betrayal lurking in the shadows, the fight for justice becomes more personal and dangerous than she ever imagined. What will it take to stand against a man who believes he's untouchable? Can Ridgway heal from its scars and find a way forward? And will Leah be able to honor her father's memory while carving her own path? The town of Ridgway lay nestled in the heart of the Midwest, surrounded by vast fields of corn and golden wheat. Its streets were lined with weathered brick buildings and quaint shops that harkened back to a simpler time. For Leah Peterson, however, Ridgway had always been a paradox. It was the place where her family's roots were deepest, but it often felt like she had no place there. Leah sat in her modest living room, the glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the walls. The house was small but tidy, a reflection of her practical nature. The framed photo of her father, Daniel Peterson, dominated the mantel, a constant reminder of the man she admired and the legacy she had inherited. Daniel had been a dedicated police officer, known for his fairness and courage. Yet, his death during a protest when Leah was only 13 had left behind unanswered questions and a lingering void in her life. Leah brushed her hand over the crisp fabric of her freshly pressed uniform. Becoming a police officer in Ridgway was more than a career choice. It was a mission. She wanted to honor her father's memory and prove that justice could transcend the racial divides that often quietly simmered in the town. But Leah was not naive. She knew many saw her as an outsider in her own community, a symbol of change that unsettled Ridgway's traditions. As the clock ticked toward the start of her night shift, Leah prepared herself for another long patrol. The silence of her house amplified her thoughts, and she found herself wondering how much longer she could keep fighting this uphill battle. The streets of Ridgway were quiet as Leah navigated her patrol car through the town square. The soft hum of the engine was the only sound in the stillness. She passed by the town's iconic bakery, now closed for the evening, and the old movie theater with its flickering neon sign. These were the places she had loved as a child, but they now carried an unfamiliar weight. Her radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. Unit 14, we have a report of a disturbance near Main and Elm. Possible altercation. Respond immediately. Leah picked up the receiver. Unit 14 responding, on my way. The scene was already chaotic when she arrived. A group of people had gathered in front of the local diner, their voices raised in anger. At the center stood Rick Harrison, his face flushed with frustration. Rick was a former factory worker who had become a vocal critic of the town's changes after the factory closed. He had lost his job, his sense of purpose, and perhaps his ability to see beyond his own pain. "You people don't care about what we've lost," Rick shouted, his voice echoing off the nearby buildings. "You let them take our jobs, and now you want us to follow their rules?" Leah stepped out of her car, her boots clicking against the pavement. The crowd parted slightly, eyes narrowing as they noticed her approach. She took a deep breath, keeping her posture calm and authoritative. "Rick, what's going on here?" she asked, her voice steady. Rick turned to her, his eyes blazing with resentment. "What's going on? Look around, Peterson. This town is falling apart, and they think people like you are going to fix it." The words stung, but Leah refused to let them show. "I'm here to keep the peace, Rick. That's all. Let's talk this through before things get out of hand." But Rick sneered, dismissing her words with a wave of his hand. "Talk? There's no point. You wouldn't understand." Before Leah could respond, an unexpected voice cut through the tension. "Leave her alone, Rick." Leah turned to see Martha Grayson, the elderly owner of the diner, stepping forward. Martha was a small woman with kind eyes and a strength that belied her age. She placed herself between Leah and Rick, her voice firm but gentle. "This young woman is doing her job," Martha said, her gaze steady. "She's trying to help this town, whether you want to admit it or not." The crowd murmured in surprise, and Rick hesitated, the fire in his eyes dimming slightly. Leah felt a lump rise in her throat. She had spent so many nights feeling alone in this fight. And now, for the first time, someone had stood up for her in public. Rick muttered something under his breath before turning away. The crowd began to disperse, leaving Leah and Martha standing alone in the cool night air. "Thank you, Mrs. Grayson," Leah said, her voice soft but sincere. Martha smiled, placing a hand on Leah's shoulder. "You remind me of your father, dear. He never gave up on this town, and neither should you." Leah nodded, her heart heavy yet uplifted. As she returned to her patrol car, the weight of the evening's events lingered, but so did the unexpected kindness she had received. Back at her house later that night, Leah sat at her kitchen table, the silence of the room once again surrounding her. She thought about Martha's words, about the courage it took to speak out in a divided town. For the first time in weeks, Leah allowed herself to believe that change was possible. In the stillness, she whispered to herself, "I won't give up, Dad. Not yet." And with that, she prepared for the battles that lay ahead, her resolve stronger than ever. The morning sun cast a pale orange glow over Ridgeway, painting the streets with soft light. Leah Peterson leaned against her patrol car, sipping a lukewarm coffee from a paper cup. She had spent most of the night replaying the confrontation with Rick Harrison in her mind. His words had been cutting, but they were not unfamiliar. She had heard them before in muttered comments, cold stares, and outright hostility. But then there was Martha Grayson. Her unexpected support had been a lifeline in turbulent waters, a reminder that not everyone in Ridgeway viewed Leah as an intruder. As Leah adjusted her badge, her radio crackled. "Unit 14, disturbance reported at Ridgeway Plaza. Group of individuals blocking entrances to local businesses. Requesting backup." Leah straightened, her weariness replaced with alertness. Ridgeway Plaza was the heart of the town's economy, and any disruption there would ripple through the already struggling community. "I'm on my way," Leah responded, tossing her coffee into a nearby trash can and sliding into the driver's seat. The plaza was already crowded when Leah arrived. A dozen people stood near the entrances of the small grocery store and hardware shop, holding signs with slogans like, "Save our town," and "Ridgeway for Ridgeway folks." Their chants filled the air, drawing curious onlookers from the surrounding shops. Leah scanned the crowd and quickly spotted Rick Harrison at the forefront. His broad shoulders and commanding voice made him stand out like a beacon. Rick noticed Leah as she approached, and his expression darkened. "Here she comes, folks! The town's hero!" he called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Leah ignored the taunt and stopped a few feet away, keeping her voice calm but firm. "Rick, you know you can't block businesses like this. Let's clear the area and have a conversation somewhere else." Rick stepped forward, his face a mask of defiance. "A conversation? You mean you want us to shut up and disappear? That's all people like you want." Leah took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "No, Rick, I want everyone in this town to have a voice, but this isn't the way to be heard. All you're doing is hurting people, trying to make an honest living." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some of the protesters shifted uneasily, casting glances at each other. Leah noticed it and pressed on. "Look around you," she continued, her tone steady. "The people in these shops are your neighbors, your friends. They're struggling just like you are. If you want real change, we need to work together, not tear each other apart." For a moment, Rick seemed to waver. The lines of anger on his face softened, and Leah thought she saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. But then he clenched his jaw and shook his head. "Words don't fix anything," Rick spat. "Action does, and if you're not here to help, then stay out of our way." Before Leah could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "She's right, Rick." The crowd turned to see Paul Harrison, Rick's younger brother, stepping forward. Paul was leaner and quieter than Rick, with a thoughtful expression that contrasted sharply with his brother's fiery demeanor. "This isn't going to fix anything," Paul said, addressing the crowd. "We're angry, I get that, but taking it out on each other isn't the answer." Rick glared at his brother. "What are you doing, Paul? You've never understood what this fight is about." Paul didn't flinch. "Maybe I don't, but I know that blaming Leah or anyone else for what's happening in this town won't bring the factory back. It won't give us our jobs or our dignity. We need to be smarter than this." The crowd murmured again, louder this time. Some of the protesters began lowering their signs, uncertainty etched on their faces. Leah watched the scene unfold, her heart pounding. Rick looked around, realizing he was losing the crowd. With a frustrated growl, he threw his sign to the ground and stormed off, leaving the protesters to disperse. As the tension eased, Leah approached Paul. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere. "That took courage." Paul shrugged, his expression guarded. "Someone had to say it." "Rick's my brother, but he's not always right." Leah nodded, sensing there was more to Paul's story. "If you ever want to talk about what's going on, you know where to find me." Paul hesitated, then gave a small nod before walking away. Later that evening, Leah sat at her desk in the police station, typing up her report on the day's events. The station was quiet, save for the occasional hum of the coffee machine or the rustle of papers. As she worked, her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Maggie Torres, the local reporter known for her sharp instincts and unflinching dedication to the truth. "Got a lead you'll want to see," the message read. "Meet me at the diner in an hour." Leah frowned, her curiosity piqued. Maggie was not one to waste time on trivial matters. An hour later, Leah found herself seated across from Maggie in a corner booth of the diner. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, and the soft hum of conversation provided a comforting backdrop. Maggie slid a manila folder across the table. "I've been digging into Gerald Warren," she said, her voice low. "This town's golden boy has a lot of skeletons in his closet." Leah opened the folder and scanned the contents. Inside were documents and photos linking Gerald to questionable financial activities, including ties to companies notorious for exploiting workers and funding divisive political movements. "This is solid," Leah said, her pulse quickening, "but it's not enough to take him down." Maggie nodded. "I know. That's why I need your help. Together, we can dig deeper and find the truth." Leah looked at Maggie, then at the folder. The road ahead was fraught with challenges, but for the first time in a long while, Leah felt like she was not fighting this battle alone. The diner's lights cast a warm glow over the table as Leah Peterson flipped through the contents of the folder Maggie Torres had handed her. The documents revealed a network of shell companies tied to Gerald Warren, Ridgway's most influential businessman. Beneath his polished public persona lay a man skilled at leveraging fear and division to protect his interests. Maggie leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is just the beginning, Leah. I've got sources who say Gerald's involvement in the factory shutdown wasn't just business, it was calculated. He wanted to consolidate power in town, and taking away the main source of jobs let him control what came next." Leah's brow furrowed as she absorbed the information. "And Rick Harrison?" she asked, her tone cautious. Gerald's been using him, Maggie explained. Rick thinks he's leading a movement for the people, but he's just a pawn. Gerald funnels money and resources to stoke resentment. It keeps the town divided and distracted while he pulls the strings. Leah set the folder down and stared out the diner window. The quiet streets of Ridgeway looked peaceful, but she now saw the shadows lurking beneath the surface. If what you're saying is true, this goes deeper than I imagined, she murmured. It does, Maggie said firmly. And if we're going to stop him, we need more than what's in that folder. We need witnesses, concrete evidence, something that leaves no room for denial. Leah nodded, her resolve hardening. Then we'd better get started. The following morning, Leah found herself back in the police station's archives, combing through old files. The station was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of fluorescent lights. She had barely touched her breakfast, a half-eaten bagel sitting on the desk beside her. The folder Maggie had given her had rekindled an idea she had been wrestling with for years. Her father's old case files. Daniel Peterson had been investigating corruption in Ridgeway before his death, but much of his work had been buried or dismissed. Leah pulled out a thick binder labeled Peterson, Daniel Riot Investigation 1997. As she opened it, the musty smell of aged paper filled the air. Inside were handwritten notes, photocopied receipts, and a few blurry photographs. Her pulse quickened as she found a familiar name buried in the notes, Gerald Warren. In her father's neat handwriting were phrases like suspected financial misconduct and potential ties to extremist groups. Leah felt a chill run down her spine. Her father had been onto Gerald long before anyone else, and it had cost him his life. The sound of footsteps broke her concentration. Leah looked up to see Officer Eric Morgan, a longtime colleague, approaching her desk. "Burning the midnight oil?" Eric asked, his tone light but with a hint of unease. "Something like that," Leah replied, quickly closing the binder. Eric leaned against the desk, his arms crossed. "Look, Leah, I know you're dedicated, but maybe it's time to let some of this go. You can't fix everything wrong with this town on your own." Leah met his gaze, her expression firm. "I'm not trying to fix everything. I'm just trying to find the truth." Eric nodded, but his eyes darted briefly to the closed binder. "Just be careful," he said before walking away. Leah watched him leave, her instincts tingling. There was something about his demeanor that set her on edge. That evening, Leah met with Maggie at a secluded park on the edge of town. They sat on a bench overlooking the pond, the soft rustle of leaves providing a momentary reprieve from the tension of the day. "I found something in my father's old files," Leah said, handing Maggie a photocopy of her father's notes. "He was investigating Gerald, too. He must have been getting close, and that's why—" Her voice trailed off, the weight of her father's death heavy in the air. Maggie's expression softened. "Leah, I'm sorry. I didn't realize it was this personal for you." "It's not just about him," Leah said firmly. "It's about this town. People like Gerald have been manipulating Ridgeway for years, and it needs to stop." Maggie nodded. "Then we need to find someone who can corroborate this, someone on the inside." Leah's thoughts immediately turned to Paul Harrison. Rick's younger brother had shown a surprising amount of insight during the plaza protest. If anyone could help her understand Rick's motivations and potentially Gerald's role, it was him. The next day, Leah drove to the small mechanic shop where Paul worked. The smell of oil and grease filled the air as she stepped inside. Paul was hunched over an engine, his hands covered in grime. "Officer Peterson," he said, straightening and wiping his hands on a rag. "What brings you here?" "I need your help," Leah said without preamble. "I think your brother is being used, and I think you know it too." Paul frowned, glancing around the shop to make sure they were alone. "Rick's stubborn," he said finally. "Always has been. But yeah, I've noticed some things that don't add up. People showing up with cash, pushing him to take bigger risks. It's not like him." Do you know who's behind it? Leah pressed. Paul hesitated, then sighed. Gerald Warren. He's been meeting with Rick for months, feeding him ideas, giving him resources. But I don't think Rick understands the full picture. Leah's heart sank. This was the confirmation she needed, but it came with a heavy cost. Paul, I need you to help me, she said. If we can prove Gerald's involvement, we can stop him before this town tears itself apart. Paul stared at her, his expression conflicted. I'll think about it, he said finally. As Leah left the shop, she felt a flicker of hope. Paul's cooperation could be the key to unraveling Gerald's web of deceit. That night, Leah sat at her kitchen table, reviewing the day's findings. Her father's notes, Maggie's folder, and Paul's testimony were beginning to form a clearer picture, but there were still gaps. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maggie. Found something big. Meet me tomorrow. Same place. Leah set the phone down and looked out the window. The stars were faint against the inky sky, but their light persisted, a reminder that even in darkness, hope remained. She whispered to herself, I won't let this go, Dad. Not now, not ever. The dawn sky over Ridgeway was a palette of soft pinks and oranges, the promise of a new day, though Leah Peterson felt far from hopeful. She had spent most of the night combing through the pieces of evidence she and Maggie Torres had gathered. It felt like putting together a puzzle with half the pieces missing, but she was starting to see the outline of Gerald Warren's influence more clearly. As she parked her patrol car in front of the diner, the familiar scent of freshly brewed coffee greeted her. Maggie was already waiting in their usual corner booth, a steaming mug in hand and a folder of new findings spread across the table. You look exhausted, Maggie said, as Leah slid into the seat across from her. Sleep is a luxury I can't afford right now, Leah replied, rubbing her temples. What do you have for me? Maggie pushed the folder toward her. It's not enough to nail him yet, but it's close. Gerald's financial records show unexplained transfers to shell companies linked to Ridgeway's shutdown factory. I also found emails between him and a couple of local politicians' bribes disguised as consultation fees. He's been greasing palms to keep people quiet. Leah skimmed through the documents, her mind racing. This is big. If we can connect these payments to the unrest Rick has been stirring, it'll be impossible for Gerald to deny his involvement. But we need more than paperwork, Maggie said. We need someone on the inside to back this up. Leah nodded, thinking of Paul Harrison. He had already confirmed Rick's connection to Gerald, but she needed him to step forward publicly. The question was whether Paul would risk alienating his brother to do the right thing. Later that day, Leah patrolled the streets of Ridgeway, her mind preoccupied with the growing tension in the town. The plaza protest had left a scar, and though things appeared calm on the surface, Leah knew better. Her radio crackled to life. Unit 14, disturbance reported at Ridgeway Steel Factory. Several individuals seen entering the building. Possible, unauthorized gathering. Leah's stomach tightened. The abandoned steel factory was a symbol of the town's decline, and it had become a hot spot for unrest. Unit 14 responding, she said, gripping the steering wheel as she turned toward the factory. When she arrived, the scene was already chaotic. A group of protesters had gathered outside the factory, their voices raised in anger. The scent of smoke lingered in the air, and Leah's eyes immediately locked onto Rick Harrison standing on a makeshift platform, shouting into a megaphone. They took our jobs, they destroyed our families, and now they want us to sit quietly while they take what's left. Rick's words drew cheers from the crowd, their anger palpable. Leah stepped out of her car, keeping her movements deliberate and calm. She surveyed the area and noticed small fires burning near the factory's entrance, fueled by wooden pallets and debris. "Rick!" she called out, her voice firm. "Step down and disperse the crowd before this gets out of hand." Rick turned to her, the megaphone lowering slightly. "You again," he sneered. "You think you can stop us? You're part of the problem." "Rick, Listen to me, Leah said, taking a cautious step forward. This isn't the way to make your point. You're putting people in danger. But Rick wasn't listening. He raised the megaphone again, his voice booming. They send her to silence us, but we won't back down. This is our town. The crowd roared in agreement, and Leah felt the situation slipping out of control. She reached for her radio. Unit 14 requesting backup at Ridgeway Steel Factory. Situation escalating. As she spoke, she noticed a group of teenagers climbing through a broken window on the factory's second floor. Their laughter and taunts carried over the noise of the crowd. "Damn it," Leah muttered, breaking into a run. "Hey, get down from there," she shouted, but the teenagers either didn't hear her or didn't care. Inside the building, the fires were spreading, and Leah's heart pounded as she realized how quickly the situation could turn deadly. Just then, a scream cut through the chaos. "Help! We're stuck!" Leah spun around to see two young girls and a boy pressed against the broken window, their faces pale with fear. The fire had spread inside, trapping them on the upper floor. Leah didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward the factory, ignoring the shouts and protests around her. She grabbed a fire extinguisher from her patrol car and charged into the smoke-filled building. The heat was oppressive, and thick black smoke choked the air. Leah covered her mouth and nose with her sleeve, her eyes stinging as she made her way toward the children's cries. "Stay calm," she called out. "I'm coming." She found the three of them huddled near a staircase, the flames licking dangerously close. Leah motioned for them to follow her, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. "This way. Stay close to me." The boy tripped over a fallen beam, and Leah quickly scooped him up, guiding the girls with her free hand. The staircase groaned under their weight, and Leah prayed it would hold long enough to get them out. Just as they reached the exit, a loud crack echoed through the building. Leah turned to see the staircase collapsing behind them, flames surging higher. Outside, the crowd had fallen silent, watching in awe as Leah emerged from the factory, the children safe in tow. She set the boy down gently, coughing as she caught her breath. The children clung to her, their faces tear-streaked but unharmed. Rick stood frozen, his megaphone dangling from his hand. His eyes met Leah's, and for a moment, the anger in his expression was replaced by something else, shame, perhaps, or guilt. "This is what your actions cause, Rick," Leah said, her voice hoarse but unwavering. "Innocent people could have died today. Is that what you want for Ridgeway?" Rick said nothing, his gaze dropping to the ground. The sound of sirens cut through the tension as fire trucks and additional patrol cars arrived. The crowd began to disperse, their fervor replaced by a sense of unease. As the flames were extinguished and the scene brought under control, Leah leaned against her patrol car, exhaustion weighing heavily on her. "You okay?" a familiar voice asked. Leah looked up to see Paul Harrison approaching, his expression a mixture of concern and determination. "I'm fine," Leah said, though her voice betrayed her weariness. Paul hesitated, then said, "Rick's gone too far. I want to help you stop this before someone gets killed." Leah felt a flicker of hope. "Then let's work together," she said. That night, Leah sat at her kitchen table, replaying the events in her mind. The danger had never felt more real, but neither had the potential for change. With Paul's support and Maggie's evidence, Leah felt the pieces of the puzzle finally starting to fit together. She whispered to herself, "We're not done yet, Dad, but we're getting closer." Leah Peterson stepped into the police station early the next morning, her shoulders heavy with the weight of the factory incident. The memory of the flames and the terrified children still clung to her, a vivid reminder of how quickly chaos could escalate. The station buzzed with hushed conversations, and Leah felt the weight of furtive glances as she walked to her desk. Ridgeway's police department had always been a mixed bag. Some officers respected her, while others resented her presence. Today the air felt particularly charged, and Leah's instincts told her something was off. "Morning, Peterson," said Officer Kevin Morales, one of the few colleagues Leah trusted implicitly. He approached her desk with a cup of coffee in hand, his expression tinged with concern. "Morning," Leah replied, taking the coffee gratefully. "I heard about the factory," Kevin said, lowering his voice. "Oh, word is, people are starting to question Rick Harrison's motives. That might work in your favor." Leah nodded. "It's a start, but we're not there yet. We need more evidence, and I think Paul might finally be ready to help us." Kevin's face brightened slightly. "That's good news. With his testimony and the files Maggie found, we might have a shot at taking Gerald Warren down." Before Leah could respond, Lieutenant Andrews called her name from the doorway of his office. His voice was clipped, his expression unreadable. "Carter, in my office, now." Leah exchanged a glance with Kevin, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. She set down her coffee and followed the lieutenant. Inside, Leah was surprised to see Officer Eric Morgan already seated at the conference table. His arms were crossed, and his face bore the same guarded look she had seen the previous day. Lieutenant Andrews gestured for Leah to sit. "Close the door," he said tersely. As Leah complied, she felt her chest tighten. Something was definitely wrong. "We've uncovered something concerning," Andrews began, sliding a small USB drive across the table toward her. "It's a recording one that implicates someone in this department in inappropriate conduct." Leah's stomach dropped as she picked up the drive. "What kind of conduct?" she asked, her voice steady despite the knot forming in her gut. Andrews' expression darkened. "Officer Morgan has been secretly communicating with Rick Harrison and Gerald Warren's associates, sharing sensitive information about our operations. When I confronted him, he confessed." Leah's head snapped toward Eric, her disbelief evident. "You did what?" Eric shrugged, his gaze cold. "Don't act so surprised, Carter. People like you think you can waltz in here and change everything, but Ridgeway doesn't need you. You don't belong here." Leah clenched her fists under the table, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. "You betrayed this department. You betrayed this town." "I stood with the people who actually care about Ridgeway," Eric shot back, his tone venomous. "You're the one stirring the pot, making everything worse." "Enough," Andrews interjected, his voice sharp. He turned to Leah. "Morgan is suspended effective immediately, and an internal investigation is underway. But this is bigger than him. If Gerald Warren has people inside the department, we need to act fast before he tightens his grip." Leah's mind raced. Eric's betrayal was a devastating blow, but it also confirmed what she had long suspected, that Gerald's influence extended far beyond Rick Harrison. "I'll keep pushing," Leah said resolutely. "I'll find what we need to expose Gerald, no matter what." Andrews nodded. "Be careful, Carter. This is dangerous territory." That evening, Leah met with Paul Harrison at the diner. He sat across from her, fidgeting with his coffee cup, his usual calm demeanor replaced by visible unease. "Paul, I need you to be honest with me," Leah said, her tone gentle but firm. "If you know anything that could help us take Gerald down, now is the time to speak up." Paul sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Rick's in deeper than even I thought. Gerald's been promising him all kinds of things, money, a role in rebuilding Ridgeway, but it's all lies. I've seen the documents. Gerald's not fixing anything. He's tearing this town apart to line his own pockets." Leah leaned forward, her pulse quickening. "Documents. Do you have them?" Paul hesitated, then nodded. "They're at Rick's house. I know where he keeps them. If I can get them, will that be enough?" "It'll be a start," Leah said. "But you'll need to testify. Gerald won't go down without a fight, and we need someone on the inside to confirm his involvement." Paul's jaw tightened, and he looked away. "Rick's my brother, Leah. If I do this, it'll destroy what's left of our relationship." Leah reached across the table, her voice softening. "I know this is hard, Paul, but think about what's at stake. This isn't just about Rick or you. It's about the future of this town. You have the power to make a difference." Paul nodded slowly. though his expression remained conflicted. "I'll think about it." Leah returned home that night, exhaustion weighing on her like a lead blanket. As she opened her front door, she froze. The living room was in disarray, furniture overturned, papers scattered, and the window smashed. A large rock sat in the center of the room, a folded note tucked beneath it. Leah picked it up, her breath catching as she read the jagged handwriting. "Stop now, or you'll regret it." Leah clenched the note in her hand, her heart pounding. The message was clear. Someone was watching her, and they wanted her to back off. Her phone buzzed, and she saw Kevin's name on the screen. "Kevin," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Leah, are you okay?" Kevin asked, concern evident. "My house was vandalized," Leah replied. "They're trying to intimidate me, but it's not going to work." "Do you think it's Gerald?" Kevin asked. Leah sat down on the edge of the couch, her gaze steely. "Who else? He knows we're getting close." Kevin hesitated, then said, "Be careful, Leah. You're not alone in this, but these people don't play fair." "I know," Leah said, "and that's exactly why I won't stop." As the night deepened, Leah sat at her kitchen table, staring at the broken window. The threat had shaken her, but it had also strengthened her resolve. "I'm not backing down," she whispered to herself. The storm was intensifying, but Leah was ready to face it head-on. Leah Peterson stood in the dim light of her living room, the smashed window a stark reminder of how far Gerald Warren's reach extended. The note clenched in her hand felt heavier than its weight suggested, a chilling symbol of the stakes in this fight. She had faced threats before, but this was personal, an intrusion into the one space she considered safe. She inhaled deeply, forcing herself to focus. Fear was natural, but it could not overpower her resolve. Leah's phone buzzed, breaking the silence. "Leah," Kevin Morales said on the other end. His voice was steady, though tinged with concern. "I've been thinking about what happened. We need to meet. There's more we can do, but you can't handle this alone." "I agree," Leah said, her tone resolute. "Let's regroup at the diner tomorrow. We need a plan." The next morning, the diner was quieter than usual, the early sunlight streaming through the large windows. Leah and Kevin sat at a corner booth, a folder of notes and photos spread between them. Maggie Torres joined them a few minutes later, her laptop in tow. "First," Leah began, addressing Kevin and Maggie, "we know Eric Morgan was leaking information to Gerald. His suspension confirms there's a mole in the department. But Eric wasn't working alone." Maggie nodded. "I've been digging into Gerald's connections, and it's clear he's not just using Ridgeway. He's orchestrating something much bigger. These shell companies funnel money into holding groups that support extremist movements in nearby towns. Rick Harrison's protests are just a piece of his plan to destabilize communities and profit from the chaos." Kevin leaned back in his seat, his brows furrowed. "If we're going to expose him, we need a smoking gun. Something undeniable." Leah turned to Maggie. "Paul Harrison said Rick keeps documents at his house. If we can get to them, they might give us the proof we need." "Risky," Maggie said, glancing at Kevin. "If Rick catches you, things could escalate fast." Leah's jaw tightened. "I'll handle the risk. This town deserves the truth." That evening, Leah parked her car a block away from Rick Harrison's modest house. The neighborhood was quiet, the only sounds the occasional rustle of leaves and distant barking dogs. Paul met her near the edge of the property, his expression tense. "I told Rick I'd swing by to grab some of my tools. He's out meeting with Gerald, so we shouldn't have much trouble, but we need to move fast." Leah nodded, following Paul to the back door. He unlocked it quietly, and they slipped inside. The house was cluttered, papers and tools scattered across surfaces, evidence of Rick's disorganized lifestyle. Paul led her to a small, windowless room that served as Rick's makeshift office. "He keeps everything in that filing cabinet," Paul said, gesturing toward a battered metal drawer. Leah opened the cabinet, rifling through folders. Her heart raced as she pulled out documents bearing Gerald's name, payment records, emails, and memos detailing strategies to stir unrest in Ridgeway. "This is it," Leah said, her voice low but firm. Suddenly, the sound of a car engine reached their ears. Leah froze, and Paul's face paled. "Rick's back," Paul whispered, his voice laced with panic. Leah quickly shoved the documents into her bag. "Stay calm. Let me handle this." The front door creaked open, and Rick's heavy footsteps echoed through the house. "Paul? That you?" Rick called out, his tone wary. Paul stepped out of the room, forcing a casual tone. "Yeah, just grabbing some tools I left here." Rick appeared in the hallway, his eyes narrowing as he spotted Leah. "What's she doing here?" Leah stepped forward, her posture calm but commanding. "I asked Paul to let me in. We need to talk, Rick." Rick's expression darkened. "You've got some nerve, Peterson. First you undermine everything I'm trying to do, and now you show up at my house?" "I'm here because you're being used," Leah said, her voice steady. "Gerald Warren doesn't care about you or this town. He's exploiting your anger to serve his agenda." Rick laughed bitterly. "You think you know me? You think you know what this town needs?" "I know what it doesn't need," Leah replied. "More destruction, more division. Ridgeway deserves better, and so do you." For a moment, Rick's tough exterior cracked. His eyes flickered with uncertainty, but the walls he had built around himself quickly returned. "Get out," he said, his voice low and menacing, "before I call someone to make you." Leah held his gaze, then turned to Paul. "Let's go." Later that night, Leah and Maggie spread the stolen documents across Leah's kitchen table. Kevin joined them, his face a mixture of disbelief and anger as he read through the pages. "This is worse than I thought," Kevin said, shaking his head. "Gerald's been funding protests, bribing officials, and even paying off media outlets to control the narrative." Maggie pointed to a specific memo. "This one is key. It outlines Gerald's plan to escalate tensions in Ridgeway, using Rick as the face of the movement while Gerald quietly profits." Leah leaned over the table, her eyes scanning the evidence. "It's enough to take to the council and start a formal investigation, but we need to be careful. Gerald has people everywhere." Maggie nodded. "Agreed. If he catches wind of this, he'll bury us before we get the chance." Kevin crossed his arms. "What's the next step?" Leah straightened, her determination evident. "We present this to Lieutenant Andrews and push for an official inquiry, and we keep digging until we uncover every piece of Gerald's operation." As midnight approached, Leah sat alone in her living room, staring out the broken window she had yet to repair. The events of the day played over in her mind, the risk, the confrontation, and the small but significant victory of obtaining the documents. Her phone buzzed with a message from Paul. "Be careful. Rick's getting suspicious. I'll do what I can to help." Leah typed a quick response. "Thank you, Paul. Stay safe." Setting the phone aside, Leah allowed herself a rare moment of stillness. The road ahead was daunting, but for the first time, she felt the tide beginning to turn. "I'm not giving up, Dad," she whispered. "We're getting closer." Outside, the quiet streets of Ridgeway lay under a blanket of stars, their soft light a reminder that even in the darkest times, hope endured. Leah Peterson walked into the police station the next morning, clutching the bag containing the damning documents she and Paul had retrieved from Rick's house. She could feel the weight of her decision pressing down on her. Bringing this evidence forward was risky. Gerald Warren's influence stretched further than she initially realized, and she was certain he had allies inside the department. Lieutenant Andrews greeted her with a nod as she entered his office, the morning light streaming through the blinds. His desk was cluttered with files, but he set everything aside when he saw the determination in Leah's expression. "Lieutenant, we've got something," Leah said, placing the bag on his desk. She pulled out the documents and spread them out. "These link Gerald Warren to the unrest in Ridgeway. Bribes, financial transactions, memos, everything points to him orchestrating this chaos to consolidate power. Andrews picked up one of the memos, his brow furrowing as he read. This is serious, Carter. If these documents are legitimate, they could bring Gerald down. They're legitimate, Leah said firmly, but we need to act fast. He'll come after anyone who threatens him. Andrews nodded slowly, his expression grim. I'll take these to the council and push for an investigation. But you're right, if Gerald catches wind of this, he won't hold back. Meanwhile, Rick Harrison sat in the dim light of his living room, nursing a bottle of beer. His house was eerily quiet, the clutter and disarray mirroring the chaos in his mind. Paul's recent visit had unsettled him, and he could not shake the feeling that his brother was hiding something. His phone buzzed, and the name Gerald Warren appeared on the screen. Rick hesitated before answering. "What do you want?" Rick asked, his tone sharp. Gerald's voice was smooth, almost amused. "Rick, we need to talk. There's been some concerning activity, and I think you know what I mean." Rick's grip tightened on the phone. "What are you talking about?" "Paul," Gerald said, his tone turning cold. "I believe your brother has been working with Officer Peterson. If that's true, Rick, it's a problem. A problem you need to handle." Rick's jaw clenched. "Leave Paul out of this. He's got nothing to do with it." Gerald laughed softly. "That's where you're wrong. He's a liability now, and liabilities need to be dealt with. I trust you'll take care of it." The line went dead, leaving Rick staring at the screen, his thoughts racing. Leah and Maggie met later that afternoon at the diner. The atmosphere was tense, the weight of their findings and the potential fallout hanging heavy between them. "Lieutenant Andrews said he'd take the evidence to the council," Leah said, stirring her coffee absently. "But I can't shake the feeling that Gerald won't go down without a fight." "He won't," Maggie agreed, her tone serious. "People like him never do. But we've got the upper hand now. The documents are solid, and with Paul's testimony, we can build an airtight case." Leah hesitated. "Paul's already taken a huge risk helping us. I'm worried about what Gerald might do if he finds out." Maggie leaned forward, her expression earnest. "Then we protect him. We stick together and see this through." Before Leah could respond, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Paul. "Rick knows something's up. He's acting strange. Be careful." Leah showed Maggie the message, her stomach twisting with unease. This is bad. If Rick confronts Paul, things could escalate. That evening, Leah drove to Paul's mechanic shop. The air was heavy with the scent of grease and gasoline as she stepped inside. Paul was hunched over a car engine, but he looked up when he heard her approach. "Leah," Paul said, his voice strained, "I think Rick's onto me. He's been calling non-stop, asking questions I can't answer." "We'll figure it out," Leah assured him. "But you need to be careful. If Gerald's putting pressure on Rick, he might try to use you to send a message." Paul nodded, but his worry was evident. "I'm not scared for me. I'm scared for what Rick might do to himself if this all falls apart." Leah placed a hand on his shoulder. "Paul, you're doing the right thing. Rick might not see it now, but he will. And when this is over, you'll have given Ridgeway a chance to heal." That night, Rick stood in the shadows outside Paul's house, his mind a storm of anger and confusion. He had convinced himself that Paul's betrayal was the reason everything was unraveling. Gerald's words echoed in his mind. Liabilities need to be dealt with. Rick clenched his fists, but as he approached the house, he stopped. Through the window, he saw Paul sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a photograph of their family. For a moment, Rick hesitated. He thought about the years they had spent as brothers, about the loyalty and love that had once defined their relationship. But the weight of his anger and Gerald's manipulation pressed down on him, and he turned away, retreating into the night. Leah was at home when her phone rang. It was Kevin. "We've got a problem," he said, his voice urgent. "Rick just showed up at the station, demanding to speak with you." Leah's heart sank. I'm on my way. When she arrived, Rick was pacing in the lobby, his face flushed with frustration. Rick, Leah said cautiously, stepping toward him. What's going on? You think you've got it all figured out, don't you? Rick spat, his voice shaking. You've been working with Paul, haven't you? You're trying to turn him against me. Rick, listen to me. No, he interrupted, his fists clenching. You don't understand anything. This isn't about Gerald or the factory. This is about my family, my town. You're tearing it apart. Leah met his gaze, her voice calm but firm. Rick, I'm not your enemy. Gerald is the one using you, and you know it. Deep down, you know the truth. Rick's shoulders sagged, his anger giving way to something more fragile, fear, regret, and confusion. I don't know what to believe anymore, he muttered. Then let's figure it out together, Leah said gently. It's not too late to do the right thing. Rick stared at her for a long moment before nodding reluctantly. As the night wore on, Leah felt the pieces of the puzzle coming together. Rick's wavering loyalty, Paul's courage, and Maggie's relentless pursuit of the truth were all converging toward one inevitable confrontation with Gerald. Leah stood by her window, staring out at the quiet streets of Ridgeway. She knew the storm was about to reach its peak, but for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope. We're not done yet, Dad, she whispered. But we're getting closer. The morning air in Ridgeway was thick with tension, the kind that settled over the town when everyone knew something big was about to happen. Leah Peterson stood in Lieutenant Andrews's office, her arms crossed, as she waited for his decision. The stack of documents she had brought now rested in the middle of his desk, a mountain of evidence against Gerald Warren. We're taking this to the council, Andrews said, his voice resolute. But you need to understand something, Carter. Gerald's not just going to sit back and let this happen. He'll fight dirty, and he'll come after anyone standing in his way, including you. Leah nodded, her jaw set. I'm ready. I've already dealt with his threats, and I'm not stopping now. Andrews leaned back in his chair, studying her. You're a brave one, Peterson. Just make sure that bravery doesn't turn into recklessness. We'll need you when the dust settles. That afternoon, Leah met Maggie Torres and Kevin Morales at the diner to discuss their next move. Paul Harrison joined them, his face pale but determined. I've thought about what you said, Paul began, looking at Leah, and I'll testify. Rick may hate me for it, but I can't sit back and watch this town fall apart because of Gerald. Leah placed a hand on his arm, offering him a small, reassuring smile. You're doing the right thing, Paul. This isn't just about Ridgeway. It's about showing people like Gerald that they can't keep getting away with this. Maggie pulled out her laptop, her fingers flying over the keyboard. I've been compiling everything we've got. The documents, Paul's testimony, the footage of Rick's protests, it's all coming together. If we time this right, we can make it impossible for Gerald to spin his way out of it. Kevin frowned. And if he tries to strike first? Leah's expression hardened. Then we make sure we're ready. As night fell, Leah returned home to find another note taped to her front door. The handwriting was familiar, sharp, jagged, and dripping with malice. You've gone too far, Peterson. Stop now, or you'll regret it. Leah crumpled the note in her fist, anger flaring in her chest. This was Gerald's way of trying to scare her, to make her back down. But all it did was strengthen her resolve. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at the broken window she still had not repaired. In the quiet of the night, her father's voice echoed in her mind. Justice is justice, Leah. No matter how hard it gets, you stand your ground. The next morning, Ridgeway's town hall was packed. The council meeting had drawn an unusually large crowd, with tensions running high. Gerald Warren sat near the front, his sharp suit and calm demeanor masking the storm brewing beneath the surface. Leah watched him from the back of the room, her every nerve on edge. Lieutenant Andrews presented the evidence, laying out Gerald's connections to the protests, the factory shutdown, and the corruption that had plagued Ridgeway for years. Maggie stood to deliver her findings, her voice clear and unwavering. But it was Paul Harrison's testimony that turned the tide. Standing before the council, his hands trembling slightly, Paul recounted everything he had seen: Rick's meetings with Gerald, the money-changing hands, and the promises Gerald had made to keep Rick under his control. As Paul spoke, Leah scanned the room. The crowd's reaction was mixed: shock, anger, disbelief, but what caught her attention was Gerald's expression. For the first time, his mask of calm cracked, and she saw the faintest flicker of unease. When Paul finished, the room erupted in murmurs. The council called for an emergency recess, leaving Gerald to sit in silence, his jaw clenched. Leah approached him as the room emptied, her gaze steady. "It's over, Gerald. You can't hide anymore." Gerald smirked, though it lacked his usual confidence. "You think you've won, Peterson? You're a small fish in a big pond. People like me don't fall that easily." Leah leaned closer, her voice low but firm. "Maybe not, but this town is done with you, and so am I." That evening, as Leah left the town hall, Rick Harrison was waiting for her outside. His face was hard to read, a mixture of anger and something else, regret, perhaps. "You were right," Rick said quietly, avoiding her gaze. Leah stopped, surprised by his admission. "Rick?" "No," he interrupted, his voice gruff. "Let me say this. I let Gerald use me. I let him turn my anger into something ugly, and I hurt this town because of it. But I'm done being his puppet." Leah softened, seeing the pain in his eyes. "It's not too late to make things right, Rick. You can still help." Rick nodded slowly. "Maybe, but first, I need to fix myself." As the week unfolded, the council began its formal investigation into Gerald Warren's dealings. The town's mood shifted, hope replacing despair, as people began to believe change was possible. Leah stood in her living room one evening, staring at the repaired window. The sunlight streamed through, casting warm patterns on the floor. It was a small thing, but it felt like a symbol of the progress they were making. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maggie. "The council just voted to suspend Gerald pending further investigation." "It's happening, Leah. We're winning." Leah allowed herself a rare smile. The battle was far from over, but they had taken a crucial step. She whispered to herself, "We're getting closer, Dad. One step at a time." The suspension of Gerald Warren sent ripples through Ridgeway. For the first time in years, the power he had wielded so carefully began to waver. The town council's decision had emboldened Leah Peterson and her allies, but it also came with an undeniable sense of foreboding. Gerald was not the type to accept defeat quietly. Leah walked into the police station, greeted by a mix of cautious nods and averted gazes. The fallout from Eric Morgan's suspension had left the department on edge, and the cracks in its foundation were more visible than ever. Lieutenant Andrews called Leah into his office as soon as she arrived. His usually stoic demeanor was tinged with urgency. "Carter," he began, motioning for her to sit. "We've received reports of increased activity around Gerald's properties. Unmarked vehicles, suspicious deliveries. It's clear he's trying to cover his tracks." Leah frowned. "He knows the investigation is closing in. If we don't act fast, he'll destroy any evidence we need to take him down." Andrews nodded. "I agree. That's why I'm assigning you and Morales to conduct surveillance on his main office. We need eyes on him 24/7. Leah left the office with a renewed sense of purpose, but she knew the assignment would be far from easy. Gerald's influence ran deep, and even in the face of public scrutiny, he remained a dangerous adversary. That evening, Leah and Kevin Morales set up their surveillance post across the street from Gerald's imposing office building. The structure loomed like a fortress, its dark windows reflecting the dim streetlights. "Think he knows we're watching?" Kevin asked, adjusting the zoom on his camera. "Probably," Leah replied, her gaze fixed on the entrance. "But that doesn't mean he'll stop. People like Gerald think they're untouchable." Hours passed in relative silence, broken only by the occasional car passing by. Kevin handed Leah a cup of coffee, his expression thoughtful. "You ever think about what happens when this is over?" he asked. Leah took a sip, considering his question. "Honestly, I don't know. Ridgeway has a long way to go. Taking down Gerald is just the start." Kevin nodded. "Still, you've done more for this town than most people ever thought possible." Leah allowed herself a small smile. "It's not just me, Kevin. It's everyone who stood up, Maggie, Paul, even Rick in his own way. Change takes more than one person." Their quiet conversation was interrupted when a black SUV pulled up in front of the building. Two men in dark suits stepped out, glancing around before disappearing inside. "That's new," Kevin muttered, snapping photos. Leah's instincts prickled. "They're not locals. Gerald's bringing in outside help." She picked up her phone and dialed Maggie. "We've got activity at Gerald's office," Leah said when Maggie answered. "Two men, suits, SUV. Can you run a plate for me?" "On it," Maggie replied. Minutes later, Maggie called back. "The SUV's registered to a shell company in Chicago. Guess who's listed as a board member? Gerald Warren." Leah's grip on the phone tightened. "This confirms he's escalating. Thanks, Maggie." The next day, Leah presented the new findings to Lieutenant Andrews. The connection to the shell company strengthened their case, but it also heightened the urgency of their investigation. "We need to move on this," Leah said. "If Gerald's bringing in outsiders, he's either preparing for a fight or planning his escape." Andrews nodded. "I'll push for a warrant to search his office. In the meantime, stay on him. We can't afford to lose momentum." That evening, Leah returned to her surveillance post. Kevin was already there, a look of concern etched on his face. "Something's happening," he said, gesturing to the building. Leah followed his gaze. Several men were loading boxes into a delivery truck parked at the rear entrance. The men worked quickly, their movements purposeful. "They're clearing out," Leah said, her pulse quickening. Kevin grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 14, requesting backup at 125 Main Street. Possible evidence tampering in progress." As Leah and Kevin exited their vehicle, the truck's engine roared to life. The men inside the building scattered, and the truck sped toward the exit. "Stop the truck!" Leah shouted, drawing her flashlight. The vehicle skidded to a halt as additional patrol cars arrived, blocking its path. Officers surrounded the truck, forcing the driver to step out. Inside, they found boxes filled with shredded documents and computer hard drives. "Looks like we got here just in time," Kevin said, exhaling in relief. Leah nodded, her mind racing. "This is it, Kevin. We've got him." The discovery of the shredded documents and hard drives set off a firestorm. News of the raid spread quickly, and public opinion began to shift even further against Gerald Warren. Maggie Torres published a scathing article detailing the evidence, painting a clear picture of Gerald's corruption. Leah watched from the sidelines as Ridgeway began to awaken from its long slumber. The people were angry, but they were also inspired. Community leaders stepped forward, calling for unity and action. But Leah knew the fight was not over. Gerald was still free, and his allies were working behind the scenes to protect him. Late one night, Leah received a call from Paul Harrison. His voice was shaky. His words rushed. "Leah, Rick's in trouble," Paul said. "He called me, said Gerald's people are after him. He's scared, and I don't know what to do." Leah's heart sank. "Where is he?" "Old warehouse on the east side," Paul replied. "Please, Leah, you've got to help him." Leah grabbed her keys and headed for the warehouse, her thoughts racing. Rick's involvement with Gerald had led him down a dark path, but Leah knew he deserved a chance at redemption. When Leah arrived, the warehouse was eerily quiet. She found Rick huddled in a corner, his face pale and his hands trembling. "They're coming for me," Rick whispered. "I messed up, Leah. I messed up bad." Leah crouched beside him, her voice calm but firm. "Rick, listen to me. It's not too late to fix this. You can help us take Gerald down. But you have to trust me." Rick looked at her, his eyes filled with fear and regret. "I don't know if I can." "You can," Leah said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We'll face this together." As Leah led Rick out of the warehouse, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The storm was reaching its peak, but she was ready to face it head-on. Ridgeway's future depended on it. The morning light filtered through the clouds over Ridgeway, casting a subdued glow across the town. Leah Peterson drove slowly toward the station, Rick Harrison sitting silently in the passenger seat. He looked worn down, the weight of his choices etched into his face. "Rick, this is your chance," Leah said gently, breaking the silence. "If you testify against Gerald, you can start making things right, not just for this town, but for yourself." Rick nodded, though he said nothing. Leah could see the turmoil in his eyes, the struggle between fear and the desire to atone for his mistakes. When they arrived at the station, Lieutenant Andrews was waiting. Leah briefed him quickly, and Rick was escorted to an interview room. Leah lingered outside the door, her mind racing with everything that had led to this moment. Over the next few hours, Rick provided testimony that solidified the case against Gerald Warren. He detailed the meetings, the payments, and the promises that Gerald had used to manipulate him and others. It was a confession that left no room for doubt, and it set the wheels of justice in motion. Leah stepped into the room as Rick finished. He looked up at her, his expression a mix of shame and relief. "Thank you," Leah said simply. "You did the right thing." Rick nodded, his voice hoarse. "I just hope it's enough." The news of Rick's testimony spread quickly. Maggie Torres published a front-page story that detailed the full extent of Gerald's corruption. The town was abuzz with conversations, the atmosphere charged with a mix of anger and hope. The council moved swiftly, issuing a warrant for Gerald Warren's arrest. Leah was part of the team that carried it out, standing shoulder to shoulder with her colleagues as they confronted the man who had cast a shadow over Ridgeway for so long. Gerald's calm demeanor faltered as he was handcuffed and led away. His allies scrambled to distance themselves, but the damage was done. Ridgeway had seen the truth, and there was no going back. In the weeks that followed, Ridgeway began to rebuild. Community meetings became a regular occurrence, giving residents a platform to share ideas and grievances. Programs to support displaced workers were established, funded by grants and donations from neighboring towns. Leah found herself at the center of many of these efforts. Her presence was no longer met with skepticism, but with gratitude. People who had once questioned her motives now sought her guidance, seeing her as a symbol of the town's resilience. One evening, Leah walked into the diner and was greeted by a round of applause. Martha Grayson, the diner's owner, handed her a cup of coffee on the house. "You've done this town proud, Leah," Martha said, her voice warm. Leah smiled, though her eyes carried the weight of everything they had endured. "It wasn't just me, Martha. It was all of us." As Ridgeway began to heal, Leah focused on strengthening the department. She worked closely with Kevin Morales and Lieutenant Andrews to implement new policies aimed at restoring trust between the police and the community. One day, as she sifted through old files in her father's study, she came across a handwritten letter tucked between the pages of a journal. It was from her father, dated shortly before his death. "Leah," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means you've taken up the fight for justice. I always knew you would. This town is worth saving, no matter how hard it gets. Never let fear stop you from doing what's right." Tears blurred Leah's vision as she read the words. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her pocket, carrying her father's message with her as she moved forward. Months later, Ridgeway held a community event in the town square. The stage was modest, adorned with banners that read, "Unity and Hope." Leah was invited to speak, standing before a crowd that included her colleagues, Maggie, Paul, Rick, and countless others who had played a part in the town's transformation. Good evening, everyone, Leah began, her voice steady. We've been through a lot as a town. We've faced corruption, division, and loss. But we've also seen resilience, courage, and hope. She paused, letting her words settle over the crowd. This is just the beginning. Ridgeway's strength lies in its people, in our ability to come together and create something better. We've proven that even in the darkest times, we can find the light. The crowd erupted in applause, and Leah felt a swell of pride. As the event wound down, Leah stood at the edge of the square, watching families laugh and children play. Maggie joined her, a smile on her face. "You did it, Leah," Maggie said. "You helped this town turn a corner." Leah shook her head, her smile soft. "We all did. This was never about me. It was about Ridgeway." The two women stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the celebration filling the air. Later that night, Leah sat on her porch, the cool breeze carrying the faint scent of flowers. The sky was clear, the stars shining brightly. She held her father's letter in her hands, reading it one more time before placing it back in the journal. "I kept my promise, Dad," she whispered. "I didn't back down." Leah closed her eyes, letting the peace of the moment wash over her. Ridgeway still had challenges ahead, but for the first time in years, the town had hope, and so did she. Leah Peterson's journey reminds us that even in the face of corruption, division, and fear, resilience and kindness can prevail. Ridgeway's transformation wasn't just about one person, but a community choosing hope over despair, unity over division, and justice over silence. If you enjoyed this story of courage and perseverance, be sure to like the video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring and thought-provoking stories. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that shines a light on the strength of the human spirit. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.